"I'll marry him," Annalise said, and the words came out steadier than she felt. Because someone in that kitchen had to sound like they had a plan. Her father wouldn't look up from the bank letter folded so many times it had gone soft at the creases. Her mother stood at the stove with a pot of water that had stopped boiling 10 minutes ago, and nobody had noticed. Outside, the wind off Lake Huron rattled the porch shutters the way it had rattled them every November for as long as Annalise Whitcroft had been alive, and inside, her family's entire future sat on the table in the shape of a single piece of paper with a number on it that none of them could pay. She was 26 years old. She had never once considered that the man who would decide the rest of her life might be a stranger from 3 farms over who had said maybe 9 words to her in as many years. It hadn't started with him. It had started 3 weeks earlier, when the grain co-op called in the loan her father had taken out after the bad harvest, the one before that, and the one before that. Bruce Whitcroft had built his life on this stretch of land outside Bayfield, Ontario, the way his father had and his father's father before him, and watching him sit at that table with his hat in his lap, studying his own hands like they belonged to someone else, was the first time Annalise understood that land could be lost the same quiet way it was kept. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a slow accumulation of bad seasons nobody talked about until the talking was too late to matter. "There's a way through this," her father had said finally, not lifting his eyes. "Just one, and it's not mine to ask of you, but I'm asking anyway, because I don't have anything else left to offer the bank." That was how Annalise learned the name Dominic Faulkner. Everyone in the county knew the Faulkner land, 3,000 acres running along the bluff above the lake, the biggest cattle and dairy operation for 40 kilometers, run by a man people described less than they speculated about. He'd taken it over young, after his father died, and his mother went back to her family in Halifax and never returned. He kept to himself in a way that small towns find unforgivable. He didn't go to the Legion on Fridays. He didn't sit through the church suppers. When he came into Bayfield for supplies, he was polite and brief and gone again before anyone could properly study him. And that absence of information was exactly the kind of thing a town fills in with its own imagination. Some said he was cold. Some said worse. Nobody said it to his face, because for all the talk, nobody could point to a single unkind thing he'd actually done. What he had done, apparently, was here, through the particular grapevine that runs through every small Ontario town faster than the actual roads, that Bruce Whitcroft was about to lose his farm, and he had sent word, through the lawyer who handled both their families' affairs, that he was prepared to settle the debt in full, in exchange for a marriage. "He's not asking you to love him," her father said, and his voice cracked on the word in a way that made Annalise's chest hurt more than the offer itself did. "He's asking for a wife who'll run his house and stand beside him at the things a man in his position is expected to stand at. That's the whole of it, according to the lawyer. A contract. Nothing more than that, if that's all you want it to be. And if I say no..." Her father didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said it for him. The bank, the auction notice, already typed up somewhere in a Goderic office, the slow procession of everything her family had ever built being itemized and sold off to strangers. She thought about her mother's hands, swollen at the knuckles from 40 years of this same land. She thought about her younger brother, 14 years old, who still believed the farm would be his someday. She thought about the particular kind of fear that lives in a household. Once it understands, it can lose everything, and how that fear doesn't ask permission before it moves into every room of a house. "I'll marry him," she said again, quieter this time, like she was trying the sentence on to see if it still fit once the kitchen had gone silent around it. But she made her father look at her when she said the next part. "I want to meet him first, before anything is signed. I want to hear it from him, not from a lawyer's letter. And if I don't like what I hear, I'm not doing it, not even for the farm. You'll have to find another way." Her father's eyes were wet when he nodded, and something in Annalise settled slightly, because at least this much was true. She was choosing, even inside a situation built entirely out of things she hadn't chosen. It wasn't nothing. It would have to be enough. Dominic Faulkner came to the farm 2 days later, in a truck that had clearly seen better winters, and Annalise watched him from the kitchen window before he ever reached the porch. Tall, dark-haired, dressed like a man who'd come straight from work because there hadn't been time to do otherwise, moving with the unhurried economy of someone who has never needed to convince anyone of anything. He knocked. He waited. When her father let him in, he took his hat off before he was even fully through the door, which was a small thing. But Annalise noticed it the way you notice small things when you're looking for reasons either to be afraid or not to be. They sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where the bank letter still lay, though her mother had at least had the grace to clear the teacups. "I won't waste your time pretending this is something it isn't," Dominic said. His voice was low even with none of the performative gentleness of a man trying to seem harmless. "I need a wife. Not out of any romantic notion. I run a house and an operation that's outgrown what I can manage alone, and there are aspects of both that require someone in that position, formally, publicly. I'm not interested in pretending otherwise to you or to anyone else. And what happens to me inside that arrangement? You'd have your own room, for as long as you wanted it that way. You'd have authority over the house. Full authority, not the appearance of it. I won't interfere with how you run it, and I won't ask anything of you beyond what we agree to here, today, between the two of us. Not later. Not after the contract's signed, and there's no one left to hold me to it." He paused. "I know what people say about me in town. I'd rather you hear the terms from me and judge for yourself than take their word over mine." It was not romantic. It was not even particularly warm. But it was honest in a way that struck Annalise harder than any tenderness could have, because she had spent 3 weeks being handed her own future by other people's decisions. And here, finally, was a man laying the actual terms on the table and waiting. Genuinely waiting. She could see it in the stillness of him, to hear what she'd say back. "I want it in writing," she said. "Everything you just told me. My own room. My authority in the house. No expectations beyond what we agree to today. If any of that changes, I want the right to leave, debt or no debt." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the loosening of an expression that had been braced for an argument and didn't get one. "That's fair. I'll have the lawyer draw it up exactly as you've said it. Then I'll marry you, Mr. Faulkner." "Dominic," he said, "if we're doing this, you may as well start there." The wedding was small and quick and entirely without ceremony. A magistrate in Goderich, her parents and his foreman as witnesses. A signature that took less time than it had taken Annalise to decide on what dress to wear. She remembered almost nothing about the day itself, except the cold of the courthouse hallway, and the steadiness of Dominic's hand when he'd offered it to help her down the front steps afterward. An automatic courtesy that meant nothing, and somehow meant something anyway, because he hadn't needed to do it, and he'd done it regardless. The farmhouse on the Faulkner land was bigger than anything Annalise had ever lived in, and emptier. Dominic showed her to a bedroom at the end of the upstairs hall, sun-faced, with a view over the bluff to the lake, and told her, simply, that it was hers, that the door locked from the inside, that he kept to the room on the opposite end of the hall, and had no intention of changing that arrangement. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than the smallness of the moment probably warranted. "You don't need to thank me for keeping my own word," he said, and left her to settle in. The first weeks were an education in a kind of loneliness Annalise hadn't anticipated. Not the loneliness of being unwanted, but the strange, hollow loneliness of being entirely correct about a man who had told her exactly what to expect. Dominic was gone from before dawn most days, out with the herd or the hired hands or the equipment that was always, it seemed, on the verge of breaking. He ate dinner with her most evenings, briefly, with the kind of polite conversation two strangers manage at a shared table, and then retreated to his study with the ledgers until long after she'd gone to bed. She threw herself into the house instead, because it was the one part of this new life that was unambiguously hers. She reorganized the kitchen, which had clearly been run for years by a housekeeper who came twice a week, and otherwise left things to manage themselves. She learned the names of the hired hands, Garrison and his 2 sons, and a quiet older man named Pruitt, who'd worked the Faulkner land since before Dominic was born, and who eyed Annalise for the first month with the wary patience of a man who'd seen housekeepers and brides come and go and wasn't yet convinced she'd stay. It was Pruitt, in fact, who gave her the first real window into her husband. He gave the McAllisters their grazing rights back last winter. Pruitt told her one afternoon, while she brought coffee out to the men working the south fence. Didn't have to. They'd defaulted fair and square on the lease. He just tore it up and told them to keep using the land till they got back on their feet. Never told a soul in town. I only know 'cause I drew up the papers myself and then watched him burn 'em. Why would he do that and never say anything? Pruitt shrugged, like the answer was obvious. Man doesn't do good things to be seen doing them. That's not most folks' way, but it's his. It was a small story, and it shouldn't have changed much. But Annalise found herself turning it over for days, fitting it against the version of Dominic Faulkner the town had constructed, the cold, unknowable man who kept to himself, and finding that the two versions didn't sit easily together at all. She started noticing other things after that. The way he asked, without making a production of it, what she thought before any decision touching the house was made. The way he'd started leaving for the barn 10 minutes later than he used to, just enough time to eat breakfast across from her instead of grabbing toast on his way out the door. The way, on a morning in early winter, when she came down with a fever that kept her in bed for 3 days, he'd had Mrs. Garrison from the next farm over come stay in the house the entire time, in case you need a woman around, not just me hovering in a doorway not knowing what to do, and how she'd later learned, from Mrs. Garrison herself, that Dominic had checked on her twice each night quietly, never waking her, just making sure the fire in her room hadn't gone cold. He never mentioned it. She had to find it out sideways, the way she found out most things about him. Not from what he said, but from the small, careful architecture of what he did. "You don't have to keep doing kind things and pretending you didn't," she told him one evening, when she'd finally pieced enough of it together to say it out loud. They were at the dinner table, the dishes mostly cleared, the kind of quiet between them that had slowly stopped being uncomfortable. "I notice. I just want you to know that I notice." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slightly on its saucer. "My father wasn't a kind man," he said finally. "He made a great show of generosity when people were watching, and made my mother's life a misery when they weren't. I think somewhere along the way I decided the opposite was safer. If no one's watching, then it can't be performance. It's just what's true." It was the most he'd ever told her about himself, unprompted, and Annalise understood with a small ache that she was being given something rare, not a declaration, not even really an opening, just a single honest piece of a man who had spent his whole life making sure honesty cost him nothing he could be accused of. "I think it's the opposite of what you're afraid of," she said carefully. "I don't think people who do kind things in secret are hiding anything. I think they just never had anyone teach them it was safe to be seen doing them." He looked at her then in a way he hadn't before, not guarded, not measuring her for some hidden angle, just looking, the way you look at someone you've started, against your better judgment, to actually see. Spring came slow and wet that year, the way it always does along the lake, and with it came the trouble Annalise had almost let herself forget was always sitting somewhere in the wings of a story like this one. His name was Reginald Ashby, a land speculator from London, Ontario, who had spent 2 years trying to buy up the Faulkner Bluff property to subdivide it for lakeside cottages, and who had been refused, politely, and then less politely, every time he'd approached Dominic with an offer. Ashby came to the farm in late April, uninvited, dressed in a suit entirely wrong for the mud of a working yard, and made his pitch directly to Annalise instead, finding her alone at the clothesline, smiling in a way that made her skin prickle before he'd said a single word she could object to. "I understand your husband can be difficult to reach on matters of business," Ashby said, "but you, Mrs. Faulkner, strike me as a reasonable woman. A woman who married into circumstances, shall we say, rather than chose them outright. I imagine a settlement substantial enough to clear whatever remains of your family's debt, and then some, might carry weight with a woman in your position, independent of your husband's feelings on the matter." Annalise set down the laundry basket very deliberately before she answered, because she didn't trust her hands not to shake with anger rather than fear. "Mr. Ashby, I think you've mistaken the nature of my marriage for something it isn't. I don't sign things behind my husband's back, and I certainly don't take payment to do it. I'd ask you to leave the property and not come back." "A pity," Ashby said, and there was something in the way he said it, a thin, cold edge under the politeness, that made her watch him all the way down the drive until his car was gone. She told Dominic that night, expecting anger, perhaps even directed partly at her for having spoken to the man at all. What she got instead was something quieter and far more unsettling. A stillness in him that she'd come to recognize as the version of Dominic Faulkner that the town's rumors had actually been describing, the one capable of the things people whispered about without ever quite naming. "He's done this before," Dominic said. "Tried the foreman. Tried Pruitt. if you can believe it, with an offer that would have made the man's grandchildren rich. He's running out of people to try, which means he's running out of patience. He looked at her, and something in his expression made her realize, for the first time clearly, that his concern wasn't only about the land. He came at you because he thought you'd be the easiest. Because he assumed, wrongly, that a marriage like ours meant you had no real loyalty to defend. He doesn't know me very well then. No, Dominic said, and there was something almost like pride under the flatness of his voice. He doesn't. The trouble didn't end there. 2 weeks later, fences were found cut on the western boundary. A dozen head of cattle scattered into the Pruitts' adjoining land before anyone noticed. And though nothing could be proven, everyone on the Faulkner property understood exactly whose hand had likely been behind it. Dominic spent 3 days riding the boundary lines with Garrison and his sons, grim and exhausted, while Annalise managed the house and the worry in equal measure, surprised at how much of the worry was for him specifically, not for the farm, not for the arrangement, but for the particular set of his shoulders when he came in each night, for the way he ate without really tasting anything, for the toll of carrying a fight he refused to let touch her directly. On the 4th night, she found him in his study long after the rest of the house had gone dark, staring at a map of the property like it might offer him a strategy the daylight hadn't. "You don't have to manage this alone," she said from the doorway. "It's not your fight. It became my fight the moment Ashby walked up my clothesline and tried to buy my loyalty like it was a commodity," she said. "I live here. This is my home too, whatever the paper that brought me here says about why." Something in him seemed to give way very slightly at the word home. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the farm, he talked to her like a partner, rather than a house guest he was being careful around. Laid out the boundary lines, the legal options, the limits of what local police could do without proof, the quiet calculation of a man who had been managing threats alone for most of his adult life because he'd never had anyone he trusted enough to manage them with. It was past midnight when they finished, and neither of them moved to end the conversation, the silence between them comfortable, in a way it had taken months to earn. "Why didn't you ever marry before this?" she asked, the question arriving before she'd quite decided to ask it. "Surely there were women in the county who'd have had you, debt or no debt, contract or no contract." Dominic was quiet for a long moment. Because every one of them wanted Dominic Faulkner, owner of 3,000 acres, the way you want a deed to a piece of land. Nobody wanted the actual person underneath the deed. "I'd rather be alone than spend a life with someone who only ever saw the property." He looked at her, something unguarded moving across his face. "You're the first person in this house who argued with me about the terms before agreeing to them. Do you understand how strange that was to me? How much I needed it to be strange. I wasn't trying to be strange. I was trying to make sure I wasn't disappearing into someone else's life entirely." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." The fence cutting stopped after Dominic, with Pruitt and 2 RCMP officers from the Bayfield detachment, caught Ashby's hired men in the act on a moonless night in early May, caught with enough evidence, finally, to bring real charges, enough to send Ashby retreating back to London with his lawyers and his subdivision plans in ruins behind him. The trouble passed the way trouble in a small county eventually does, fading into the kind of story people would tell for a few years and then forget, replaced by whatever the next season's gossip happened to be. But something had passed between Annalise and Dominic in those weeks that didn't fade the way the trouble did. She found herself waiting for him at the window some evenings, the way she'd never have admitted to a month earlier. He found himself, she noticed, finding more and more reasons to be in the kitchen in the mornings, in the parlor in the evenings, in whatever room she happened to be in, with an excuse that was never quite enough to explain the regularity of it. It was June before either of them said anything honest about it. They were walking the upper pasture at dusk, the cattle settling for the night, the lake catching the last of the light below the bluff in a way that turned the whole world a soft, impossible gold. Annalise had stopped to watch it, and when she turned, Dominic was watching her instead. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, and then, after a pause that cost him something visible to reach past. "Everything, actually. I keep trying to find the moment this stopped being an arrangement, and I can't find it. I don't think there was a moment. I think it just happened, the way weather happens, without my permission and entirely past the point where I could have stopped it." Annalise's heart was doing something complicated and enormous in her chest. "I had a moment," she said quietly. "It was small. You carried Mrs. Garrison's basket up from the cellar without being asked, on the night I had the fever, when you thought I was asleep and nobody was watching to see you do it. I wasn't asleep. I watched you do it anyway. That's a strange moment to fall for someone over." "It wasn't the basket," she said. "It was that you did it the same way, whether anyone was looking or not. I'd spent my whole life being told what a husband owes a wife on paper. I think that was the first time I understood what one might actually give her, instead." Dominic reached for her hand then, slowly, like he was giving her every chance to pull away before he committed to it, and when she didn't, his fingers closed around hers with a careful, deliberate gentleness that told her more than any speech could have. "I never wanted you to feel like part of a transaction," he said. "I told myself that's all this could ever practically be, because the alternative felt like more than I had any right to ask of someone whose whole life I'd already upended once. But you were never that to me, not after the first month. Maybe not even before it." "I know," Annalise said, and found that she did, fully and without reservation, in a way that surprised her with how little fear was attached to the knowing. "I think I've known for a while. I think I just needed you to be the one to say it first, because I needed to know it was true for you, and not just true for me." "It's true," he said. "It's the truest thing I've got." She thought, standing there with the lake gold below them, and her husband's hand warm and certain around hers, about the girl who had sat at her parents' kitchen table 3 months earlier and said, "I'll marry him," with her hands pressed flat to hide their shaking, and about how impossible it would have been to explain to that girl what this particular moment would feel like. Not survival, not the discharge of a debt, not even relief that the worst hadn't come to pass. Something else entirely. Something she hadn't had a name for back then because she hadn't yet lived long enough to need one. She had it now. It wasn't luck, what had happened to her, and it wasn't an accident of circumstance either, however much it had started as one. It was two careful, guarded people choosing, in small daily increments that neither of them had announced even to themselves, to let each other matter. It was a hand offered on a courthouse step that hadn't needed offering. It was a fire kept lit in a fevered woman's room by a man who never once mentioned doing it. It was a question asked honestly across a kitchen table when honesty cost something, and an answer given the same way. Annalise looked out at the lake, and then at her husband, and understood that whatever this was, this farm, this man, this life she had walked into sideways and afraid, it was hers now in a way the contract had never made it, not because anyone had given it to her. Because she had stayed long enough, and been brave enough, and honest enough, to build it for herself, one true day at a time, until there was nothing left of the arrangement at all, and only the marriage remained.